Sacred geometry is something more than most people think that it is. It's like a code language, a symbolic code language for consciousness. Our advancement of technology, it makes it possible for more human beings to be connected, right? So here we are talking about this subject. This subject has always been happening with humans forever. And so now 3 of us are talking about this, and more people are going to see this production and say, okay, yeah, I have experiences related to that. So what I'm getting at is that because of technology, more people are saying, yes, I have an experience that's very much related to the experience that they're talking about. So it's a way of confirming for others their experience, hearing other people talk about it. But it's been happening forever. There's nothing new. We're not talking about anything new. There is nothing new to talk about. There is no experience new to talk about. People have been experiencing angelic beings, higher dimensional beings, travelers from other dimensions forever. And because we have technology that makes it possible to share the story across the globe, that's how we have this, oh yeah, well that's real. But it's always been real. It's always been the human experience.
Welcome back to Cosmic Convergence. I'm joined by my co-host Daniel, and today we're welcoming Vandorn Hinnant, a multidisciplinary artist, sculptor, and poet whose work explores the connection between geometry, nature, and the human spirit. Vandorn blends art and mathematics into what he describes as sacred compositions, reflecting the patterns of reality itself. Everyone like, share, and subscribe for more conversations like this one, but let's get into it. Welcome, Vandorn. Thanks for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you, Christian. Great to be here.
Thank you. And just to start everything off, I just wanted to ask, what brought you into sacred geometry to learn about it? It's my understanding that you had a mentor who brought you into this.
1989, I was in Winston-Salem at the National Black Theater Festival, the summer of 1989, and I was invited to join this elder at a workshop that he was conducting the next day. So I went back. I brought a young man, one of my coworkers' sons, from A&T State University. I brought him with me. So the 2 of us went to Winston-Salem to a little house not far from downtown Winston-Salem, and we encountered something called the 12 pages. So at that particular time, Robert Lee Powell Sr., who was a retired establishment physicist, who was actually responsible for having brought to us non-invasive holographic technology. So that's something that is commonplace today, which means that you can actually scan something without penetrating it physically. You scan it and you have the vibrations or the vibrational signatures of the matter analyzed. Anyway, I can't talk about holography as if I know a lot about it, but Robert Lee Powell Sr. and one of his previous students, who at that particular time was a co-worker with him, they actually invented non-invasive holographic interferometry. That's what it's called, right? The 12 pages was simply a way of introducing an individual to what is conveniently called sacred geometry. So, I have written more definitions on sacred geometry than I can remember, and all of them are different and exact, to the point, succinct, and they all tell the story from a different vantage point. So sacred geometry is something more than most people think that it is. It's like a code language, a symbolic code language for consciousness. Back to Robert Lee Powell Sr. Powell had taught at Texas Southern. That was his last job, if I may. He had left establishment physics, somewhat disappointed in the fact that he didn't get a chance to take that invention to the bank. His employer did. So he left the company and he tried to do something on his own, but he couldn't get the financing. So he decided to start teaching, and he was teaching at Texas Southern and retired from there, and then started teaching sacred geometry. Anyway, he had interfaced with a lot of significant people. Linus Pauling, he wrote Linus Pauling, and Pauling wrote him back saying, "This is over my head." And he wrote a number of significant people, Ian Stewart and a number of others. I can't even remember all of them. I have some of the copies of some of the papers because I'm actually handling his archives momentarily until we can find a home for his archives. So I took the 12 pages and I fell in love with it because I had already studied drafting when I was in the 8th grade and the 10th and 12th grade, I believe. So I had drafting in 4 years in high school. And so this was like drafting to me. But of course, it was something different. And when I started studying it, I began to learn more and more about the meaningfulness of what sacred geometry represents and what it can do for an individual or for humankind for that matter.
Yeah, thank you. And I know you shared some images with us, and we can go through them so we can talk a bit about your work and the importance of sacred geometry, because I think it's really important for people to understand this today, because it's not really taught that much in schools, or at least it wasn't for me.
Christian, there are reasons that it has not been disclosed to the general public. Now we're talking about what some people conveniently call conspiracy theories. When I say to you there's a reason, this is a fact that very few people know. There's a documentary named The Lottery of Life, and I forgot the subtitle, but you can go find it. And what my wife and I learned in this documentary was that during the time of Jimmy Carter's tenure as the director of the Trilateral Commission, he and his subordinates were given an assignment to dumb down the American public through what we conveniently call the education system. So those of us who are awake in the matrix, we realize that he and his comrades succeeded. And it is my contention that Jimmy Carter lived the rest of his life, he tried to clear his conscience of that crime against humankind. And he did all of this good for humankind, I think, as a result of having been tethered to a political agenda that did not match his spiritual vibrational signatures, if that makes any sense to you. I believe that he was above that type of those type of machinations, but that was his assignment, that was his job, and he and his subordinates did succeed with the assignment. For those of once again, for those of us who are awake in the matrix, we understand that he was successful. He and his comrades were successful in dumbing down the American public, so that there would be no more contention against the, what can we call it, the political policy of the government.
Like the status quo, keeping everything
Keeping people asleep.
away. Yep.
Well, you see, what happens is when you understand sacred geometry, you understand relationship in a most significant way. And what has happened, systematically happened over hundreds of years, is human beings have been seduced into not understanding what, and I'm going to use a very strong word here, right relationship. Okay. Now, that sounds like there's a right and a wrong, but when I say right relationship, I'm talking about understanding how nature works, and we are part of nature, how nature works from a holistic vantage point. So we have a term, a distortion, that has been introduced into the human equation. So there are many people, humans that is, running distortions, and that's their business. We all have free will. But there's a price to pay for running distortions. And those distortions that have been running in the psyche of humankind are magnified and amplified by individuals who are service to self. And there are many in the audience who understand what I mean by the term service to self versus service to other. So there are two different types of humans in the world. One group, we call them service to self. The other group we say is service to other. And the service to self-oriented human beings are all about control and manipulation and domination. And those are the individuals across a great span of time who have said we cannot allow the masses to be well informed about how nature works, the nature of reality, which has everything to do with right relationship with self so that one can have right relationship with other. So here's a poem that my mentor penned. I think it was written in 1989 before I met him, May. I can't read it at this particular scale, but I can only say that it was a fun poem to pull up because those four circles, those are four stanzas, and each one of those stanzas is related to a very specific circle there. So the circle on the far right is called the A circle. The circle on the far left is called the B circle. The circle above is called the C circle, and the circle below is called the D circle. That's because those four intersections in the center, right, where you see the vesica piscis, those four intersections are the A, the B, the C, and the D point. So those circles are called A, B, C, D circles.
To start reading it, it says, "And Bob said, a geometric offering to Sophia by Scalpel Powell. She enters the manifest, mother of the explicate. She introduces the profane. Her metal is silver. The work color is red for sacred architecture. She bees the A circle. She centers on the edge of A. Mother of the significant other, she introduces the Podner. Her metal is gold. The work color is yellow for sacred science. She bees the B circle. She centers on the sky crossing of A and B. Mother of the significant centers, she introduces the first number. Her offering is an above. The work color is blue for sacred art. She teases triune 7. She bees the C circle. She centers on the earth crossing of A and B. Mother of the quadrivium, she introduces the profane love, her offering the first vertification. The work color is black for sacred law. She supports from a below. She bees the D circle. Together, they teach my neighborhood of the garden of Sophia."
Yeah, a beautiful love offering. And so the thought came to me after reading this. We can look at this as being a soliloquy in a play. Okay, so here's Robert Lee Powell standing in front of the world, and here's his love offering. And for me, I think of it as a soliloquy. And so there's an interesting story behind this image. There's a woman in California who saw an image that looks like this that my mentor had drawn. And it was in such a bad condition. It was on ratty paper. It was discolored. And she wanted it so badly that I said, I will redraw it for you and send it to you. So I gave it a name, page 18. Can you read at the bottom what it says, Christian? Page 18.
Sure. It says, page 18 from the Book of Miraculous Prayers and Visions, courtesy of PSI's Robert L. Powell, Senior Visual Mathematics Laboratory.
Yes. So Robert Powell had an institute called the Practical Science Institute, and myself and a great many other people came through that institute and studied with him. And so he had the Visual Mathematics Laboratory. He named it the G.R. Lomanitz Visual Mathematics Laboratory. After he transitioned, I decided to change it from the G.R. Lomanitz Visual Mathematics Laboratory to the Robert L. Powell Senior Mathematics Laboratory, Visual Mathematics Laboratory. So I took some liberties to change one of the schools, if I may. And I'll stop there. I'll simply say that this beautiful 12-fold symmetry mandala, what's above is below. And this one day, I hope to create the same mandala, but rotate it and ever so slightly so that this one square is sitting atop the other square. It's difficult to put this into words, but I want to rotate both mandalas. I think it's either 15 degrees or maybe 15 degrees. And when I do that, two of the squares will touch each other. The one above will touch the one below. And that is going to change the energy on the piece significantly. But that's a job that I haven't been willing to slow down to do. It's
really interesting. It's really interesting that you share this too, because especially when it comes to sacred geometry and ancient history, we can see a vast multiple different cultures, Egyptian, Sumerian, like all these different cultures that have these sacred geometric, what we label art, but I feel like there's definitely more to it, and in mosaic pieces and stuff. And it's like, how do they know about this too? And it's like, I feel like it can't be coincidence. It's like the lost science sort of, and we're like rediscovering it and realizing in current day, like the significance of what sacred geometry represents. Even when we get into like the weirder realms, or we're talking about other beings and stuff, or UFOs and craft, even some of the craft that are being witnessed are of these sacred geometrical shapes, which I find fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, that we could spend quite some time talking about the hows and whys of this. But a short statement might be that sacred geometry gives us some idea about how consciousness organizes itself in the worlds of duality, where you have polarity, where you have the electromagnetic spectrum, which is quite expansive. You can't have the electrical without the magnetic. You cannot have positive force without a negative force. So this thing that we call polarity is the norm in the worlds of duality. The term worlds of duality is understood in certain spiritual traditions. It simply means that there's like an in-breath and an out-breath. That's one of the most beautiful and simplistic ways of talking about duality, you know. But I'm a poet, so I don't want to start waxing poetically. Oh, really? We'd all be in trouble if I started waxing poetically. So I'm going to try to keep this clean, if I may, and leave poetry out of the equation. But yeah, these mandalas do have an effect upon consciousness. But for one moment, whether you look at the one at the top or the bottom, they're identical. This is something that literally hundreds of people have drawn over an extended period of time. It's actually related to the rose window in the Chartres Cathedral. Okay. So each one of those stations is a station. Now, that's a I think that's a 5 iteration fractal. That means there's 5 squares that are 5 different sizes spiraling from the outside to the inside or either from the inside to the outside. And I wanted to go 6 because I simply like the number 6, but 5 is good. I mean, 6 would have been ideal, but I just didn't want to keep, because of the size of the paper that I was working on, I didn't want to keep reducing the scale because I started on the outside. A lot of fractals begin on the inside, but I actually started on the outside creating this fractal. So it's kind of like reverse engineered, if I may. Yes.
Yeah, it was beautiful.
This is a composition. This is from the book. Don't know what page it is, but this is a drawing that is related to what we call the square root of 2. You see one place where all the blue circles, the purple circles, and the red circles are emanating from, all centered. And there are places along those lines that are, we'll say, related to what we call the square root of 2. There's no reason in trying to be specific and tell you what length on there is the square root of 2. But let's just say that this particular drawing has a lot to do with what we call the number, the square root of 2. So there are 12 lines emanating from the center of this particular circle, and those lines have on them little dots, little gold dots, and each one of those gold dots from the center of the circle is related to this digit that we call the square root of 2. And just for the reference, since I'm talking math, the radius of all of those circles, all of those black circles, is the square root of 1. So this is part of the thesis that's called The Rest of Euclid. The reason that the book is titled The Rest of Euclid is because Euclid gave us in Proposition 1, Book 1, raise a question, given 2 points on a plane, create a triangle, an equilateral triangle. I might be wrong about that. But in order to create an equilateral triangle using 2 points on a plane as a genesis, you have to know how to use a compass. You have to understand what the implications are of the relationship between those 2 points and creating 2 circles that share a radius, and what happens when you come to the intersection above the 2 original points and or below the 2 original points. So you don't end up with 1 equilateral triangle. You end up with 2 equilateral triangles. They're on the page here, on that drawing. If you look at it carefully, you'll see a bunch of little black dashes, black lines, that all of those black lines represent the square root of 1. And the reason they don't go to the very center of the circle is just to be able to more easily read the diagram. But each one of those black lines are suggestive of what we call the square root of 1. And it goes from the center of the black circle to the circumference of the black circle. And since we don't have a drawing here in this, if you imagine an infinite plane filled with these unit circles, all of them having the same radius, that is a visual statement about the notion of equal. We have this notion where we're all created equal. Well, what I just suggested, an infinite plane of unit circles that all share radius with their neighbor, that is a visual statement about the phenomenon equal. So we have embedded in sacred geometry lessons. And so when a person sees these diagrams, something is being spoken to their subconscious mind, to their hearts, and that's the higher intelligence. So the pedestrian awareness, if it's open to receiving the message, it has an aha moment. That's the purpose of sacred geometry, in my estimation, to give people an opportunity to have aha moments about that which we can consider to be from the spiritual domain or related to spiritual phenomena.
And that the black circle where you kind of see like the flower, like within each black circle, I feel like I've seen that in other places too. Just that piece of it too, kind of like a hint or a nod to this piece here.
Well, each one of those circles are identical, right?
Yeah.
And the content of all of those circles is identical, except for that one where you have those 12 lines radiating from the center. All of those circles are identical to one another. Everything that's on the interior of them is identical. So you could have the same thing going on from the center of each one of those circles. You could actually draw lines to other intersections. And what you would be doing is you would be drawing lines that are expressions of the square root of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ad infinitum. And so I have drawings that I've done that are expressions of what we can conveniently say infinite number of square roots. And that's more than we can talk about momentarily. But I was just trying to speak to what you said, Christian.
No, it's okay. No, that makes sense to me.
This is a formalization of a sketch that I did. I did a freehand sketch on some graph paper one time, 1/4-inch graph paper. And so each one of those little dots that you see was actually where a vertical axis and a horizontal axis met on a 1/4-inch grid graph paper. And that was done back in 2009, I believe, possibly earlier. But anyway, so the sketch would surface in my studies periodically. And so this past December the 31st, I formalized it, and this is what came out. And it's just one of several compositions that I have created that's related to the notion of a portal. So a lot of times I find myself realizing that almost everything that I've done, especially since I was introduced to sacred geometry, actually before that, I was actually doing artwork that was related to this notion of portals. Portals, passageways, doorways, windows between worlds, doors between worlds, portals between worlds. I was doing artwork on the subject long before I met Robert Lee Powell. But after I met him, I realized that I had been working with the notion of portal, another word for door, another word for window, in my artwork for the longest time. I have like a work of art that I created in 1991. I was part of an artist residency at the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And one of the compositions I created was titled How Long? And How Long has writing in it across the background. And it has something that represents a ground plane. It has something that kind of reminds you of a teepee, and it has a stick figure in it. So, but what you have is you have reference to a night plane and a day plane, as in a nighttime in one part of the composition, a daytime in the other part of the composition. And there are some other symbols in there. There's a symbol of the sun and a symbol for the moon and a symbol for a soul that is traveling, as in soul travel. But that composition is still related to the notion of a portal, meaning an opening, a window between locations. And
it's interesting. It's interesting you say that too, because it's like when I look at the outside, or the outside beyond the mass of the red circle, you see this plane, and it reminds me, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it reminds me of the plane whenever they're showing, like, for example, the plane, like, let's say, if you know what I'm talking about, Daniel, too, like you have that plane with the squares and it's space. And then when they show like warping space, or how like a planet has a gravitational pull, it kind of warps the space around it, where that netting kind of like folds, if that makes sense. So that's what it reminds me of.
yeah, well, thank you. You reminded me of one of the things I wanted to say about this. All of those arcing lines on the outside, I have another composition that has more of those arcing lines. So everything inside of that orange circle is inside a portal. You can think of that as being inside of a torus. So all of those arcing lines on the outside actually represent a toroidal field. Okay, and we all know that all torus all tori have a portal, and that's where, if I may, information travels from one locale to another. You know, we have all of these interesting stories, which I don't listen to and I don't talk about them. Black holes, et cetera, et cetera. We have
But like
all
the hyperbola center point
yes.
where it meets.
My contention is we're dealing with a portal, and it's a portal where consciousness is traveling from one location to another. And so we are consciousness, and we are always traveling. It's just that most of us are so identified with what I conveniently call the illusion of time that we don't realize that we're traveling, but we don't realize that we're traveling. You know,
Mm.
That makes sense. Yeah.
and so,
I've heard that too.
yeah, using language to describe what is very difficult. You know,
Yeah.
you can say the same thing 5 different ways, and you'll be telling the truth 5 different times, having said it 5 different ways. And if you are talking to a rational linearist, they will find something wrong with that conversation because they're locked into one point of view.
Mhm.
But one point of view is a limitation that I will equate to something that is something metaphorical called hell. You know,
The other thing is that Taurus field has often been seen with people that have had encounters with UFOs or beings. A local encounter we actually had with one of our neighbors, they saw a craft and had all this crazy experience happen, but they had for lack of a better word, download days later, and they saw a portal that they were coming through, and it looked like a tortoise field coming through.
Yeah, Daniel, thank you. You remind me of many years ago. There was a scholar, a professor, William Ferris Thompson, and he wrote a book called Flash the Spirit. So when I met him in Virginia at Hampton University at a conference, he gave a lecture, and he told the story of a number of African tribes would use the spiral as a way of writing, "I return to my maker." And so in 1993, I had a solo exhibition at the Hammond's House Galleries in Atlanta, and there was a woman in the audience when I gave a slide lecture at the end of the reception, and she spoke these words to me. When I saw that work of art in the front gallery, I was immediately transported back through the birth canal. She had full memory. What happened is seeing the work of art open up to her, took her back into that experience of coming through the birth canal. And a lot of people, when they're traveling between dimensions and time zones and what have you, they find themselves portaling through what might as well call a tunnel or what have you. So we have many traditions where there's a person having an experience with ayahuasca or plant medicine or just soul travel.
They see this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to do is I wanted to add just a few images to say that we have symmetry everywhere. Here's a beautiful sand dollar. I think well, not a sand dollar. What is that called again? A starfish. Thank you. Right. Not a sand dollar.
It looks dried out though, like it died and it dried out.
It's belly up. Right. Yeah. So it was laying on the beach, and it was a beautiful photo op. So I took a photograph of it. But yeah,
it's interesting though, because the darker lines in the middle of each appendage that kind of meets at the center with the white kind of also like reflects kind of the image we were looking at with the black circles that went to a center though, and you just kind of see this repeated pattern in nature.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like if you could take the appendages and fold them inwards like that, you would kind of see kind of like a toroidal shape kind of thing. But yeah, you can even see these kinds of shapes when you cut like an apple in half, or an orange.
And that was one of the slides that I had to I chose not to put in was cross section of an apple, where you have the beautiful five-fold symmetry, and some of them are just perfect. And so the next slide probably shows a flower, I believe a five-fold symmetry flower. It's a flower blossom on one of the many trees that we have in our yard. Yes, but anyway, so that's so you have a beautiful five-fold symmetry, and then the next one I think is six-fold symmetry. Right. So that's actually a cross section of a cantaloupe. But inside this cantaloupe, if you cut it right, you actually get to see where the seed pods are attached to the walls, and that gives you a perfect six-pointed star. So I've done this over and over and over again. Now this is a flower blossom for a lemon cucumber. And I was just talking to a friend yesterday about the fact that the lemon cucumber gives you five-fold symmetry petals and six-fold symmetry petals. And so one is masculine and one is feminine. And so the bees or insects pollinate these by moving from the five-fold symmetry to the six-fold symmetry and back and forth. And so that's how we experience the pollination of the lemon cucumber. Beautiful flowers, and that's a perfect
It's
example.
kind of crazy because I feel like a lot of what you're describing is so easily missed, and people kind of like, oh, that's just nature. And then they don't really think about it. But like when you investigate and you look, you're just like, there is this like intention in the universe
everywhere.
that like, yeah. And it's just this, there's a symmetry in play, but even creatures like insects like realize it. And they play by those rules, or they play by that nature, I guess. It's seen when you like look closely.
Mm-hmm.
But the challenge that we have is that we have been systematically seduced to look away from nature, to ignore it. Everybody on the forum knows that there are children that have no idea where their food comes from. And that is incomprehensible, but we won't go into that story. We'll simply say that the masses have been seduced away from nature, and that is what makes possible for the programming of the masses to be in denial of who and what they are and their relationship to the cosmos. You cannot be in relationship with the cosmos without being in relationship with nature. And this is the cover of a book titled Love, Opera House of the Soul. It took me 35 years to stop and put down everything that I was doing so that this particular book could be realized. I had been writing since way back in the early 80s, actually in the 70s. And so I had a lot of writing that had been compiled and lots of images. But this book actually shows works of art that were made all of the way up till the time that the book was published, which was about 2 or 3 years ago. And there's a volume 2 that's waiting to be published. This has, I think, 53 images. Only one is actually a photograph from our garden. I think it was a photograph of 2. But in a few moments, we'll show some images from the book, several pages. And so the next slide is actually the back of the book. We're not going to stop to read what the text says, but that's the back cover of the book. And this is book number 3 to my credit. Right, yes. Book number 1, I'm a co-author of the first book that we showed. I must correct myself. There's another book that I forgot to put the slide in. It's titled Path to the Infinite, Finding Your Sacred Center. That was actually an interview that took place several years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Mark Lee of Durham, North Carolina, has an IBM TV podcast that he does, and he interviewed me, and one of my wife's dear friends said, you could turn that into a book. So the book was supposed to be a birthday gift to me, and a young lady that was working with my wife was supposed to have been formatting it, and she actually lied, and she didn't do the work. So my wife said, well, this was supposed to be your birthday gift. And I said, well, I'll do it. So I rolled up my sleeves. I did all of the editing. The whole book was composed by me, and we published it. And so here it is. It's a lot of fun. So let's look at a few of the images in the book. That's one of the pages. I think that's page 69. Yeah. That's a composition that I love dearly. This is like a collaboration between myself and my mentor. He did a drawing that I went back and redid, and then I added other dimensions to the drawing. So I call this a collaboration between Robert Lee Powell Sr. and myself. And we were doing this year after year after year. I would create a drawing. He would see the drawing, and he would do another drawing related to it. So there was this kind of like ping pong game going on back and forth, back and forth. It was a beautiful rapport that lasted for 25 years. And I still have conversations with him in the dream world. He's still, if not teaching me, he's at least prodding me along in the dream state or through the dream world. In fact, I just saw him within the last 3 or 4 days. So anyways, title 25. Yes.
I'm also seeing the polarity with the red and blue and the as above, so below kind of imagery that repeats,
Yeah, those diamonds, that red diamond, that blue diamond, are actually related to the star points of a pentagon. So and the reason it's titled 25 is because there are actually 4 five-pointed stars that are inside that inner circle. There are 4 five-pointed stars. One is pointing north, one is pointing south, one is pointing east, and one is pointing west. But you'd have to be able to look at it carefully to be able to see that. It's a beautiful composition. And this is actually, can be thought of as a computer, numbers computer, because the radius of all of those smaller circles would be called the square root of 1. And then each one of those line segments can be determined by knowing what the square root of 1 is. And so the largest triangle, its edges are the square root of 9. Okay. And so, am I correct? Let me see now. 149, right? And then there are like the blue triangle, the base of the blue triangle at the bottom, the horizontal line, that is the square root of 4. And the red triangle that's pointing upward on the far left, that base is the square root of 1. So, and its hypotenuse is the square root of 4, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those line segments can be figured out in terms of what their value is in terms of length by understanding how to compute in a plane. This is mathematics in a two-dimensional plane.
It's also interesting because in a three-dimensional plane, like if you look at the pyramids, they notice that the pyramids themselves are a mathematical tool that can be used for a variety of things, and even measuring the circumference of the earth. There's a whole science to that. I'm not the scientist, but that's basically what I heard. And they were explaining this in a documentary that they're discovering. And it's amazing because especially at that time, I keep wondering, like, how did they know this back then? That's so interesting, especially with how complicated it is to make those structures, because we don't really, at least not fully, and we're not in full agreement in the scientific communities on how these pieces were created.
But so much truth has been gaslighted by so many players in the game. And so there are greater truths that haven't met the masses, for the simple fact that there are controllers and manipulators of data that would be enlightening and elevating to the masses. But once again, there are certain factions that want to keep the masses subjugated. So these greater truths have not been released to the general public. We have Billy Carson. We have Robert Edward Grant. We have a lot of people. One beautiful man, Eric Rankin. Just if you go look up Eric Rankin, sonic geometry, you're going to find a treasure trove of information. And I could name more people than I can actually remember momentarily. People that came before me and people during my time. Eric is probably not far from my age. He may be my younger by a number of years. But if you just look up sonic geometry, we have people like Herbert Bennett, who very few people have heard about.
That name sounds familiar.
He has something called torimetry. So he's asking us to go beyond geometry and to follow him into this world called torimetry. And unfortunately, I can't pull up the name of the person who his last name is Evans. And Jane 108 in Australia has presented information about this particular person whose last name is Evans. His first name I can't remember. But what Evans uncovered is very much related to what Herbert Bennett has uncovered and what Terrence Howard has uncovered. So we have a lot of people that are talking about this geometry from their vantage point, and nobody's wrong. Everybody's right. It's like the story of 8 blind men in a room with an elephant, and everybody's asked to describe an elephant by touching the elephant's body. So you have somebody touching the trunk, somebody touching the ear, somebody touching the tusk, the tail, you get a different story. And that's what's happening. All of us are telling the truth from our vantage point. Yeah. But anyway, that's all very interesting.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like it is something that we often forget, and there's so many stories out there, and everybody's trying to have their own spin. And
yes.
And I feel like, when we're talking about these negative forces, let's say, these negative forces, like kind of trying to keep humanity behind, I keep thinking of the in-breath and out-breath, because before it was more like, it seemed, at least to me, more controlled. And now in today's age, we have all this stuff coming out, and people are kind of like waking up to the fact. So it's like the out-breath, and it's almost like starting a cycle again, or the ending of a cycle, if that makes more sense. Yeah.
I'm glad you made reference to the breath, because I'll say that humankind has grown weary of holding its breath. So,
yeah,
so
definitely.
It's now time for a big exhalation. And so that we can exhale and actually let some of what is begging to be disclosed be revealed. The power brokers cannot hold the center, okay? Reminds me of a phrase from a play, not a play, but a piece of writing that Joni Mitchell took and made a beautiful song. I want to show you all something, okay? This is a three-dimensional form, okay? as a three-dimensional form. Some will recognize it as being related to the buckyball because that's what it is. It is the buckyball. And so what happens is this is a 3-inch diameter cast form. Cast, they call it sandstone. That's just because the company uses that term. But I have designed at least 6 of these forms and made them into pendants that people can wear. And when I first began this adventure, I didn't realize that I was the equivalent of Mickey Mouse in playing the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And so just like Mickey Mouse with the broom and telling the broom to do this, that, and the other, I learned after the fact, after I started putting these geometries out into the world, I realized that they are way more potent than I had known or imagined when I first designed them. So I'm actually putting out geometries, including the image that you're looking at on the screen. These are not just 2- and 3-dimensional expressions. They actually, like this particular composition, is related to a 3-dimensional form. It's a cross-section of a 3-dimensional form. And there are people that know that every 2-dimensional diagram has a 3-dimensional correlation in terms of an energetic body. And so sometimes I tell people that the drawings that I've done in the past can actually be seen as 2-dimensional cross sections of relationships between atoms in crystals, gemstones. So I think of all of the work that I'm doing that's conveniently called sacred geometry. It's all related to crystals and gemstones. So that's a statement that I want to make, and also a disclaimer that I'm really playing around in the world of creation. And sometimes I think of myself as the guy with the keys in the Matrix. Remember the man running around with the keys? These compositions do open up portals of awareness. This particular composition, there's a healthcare professional that lives in Durham that moved down from New Jersey about 20 some years ago. She saw this image on her computer screen, and she told me that she had a spontaneous, complete healing of her left shoulder. I don't know what the before and after was, but then we have another person who lives in Greensboro, and I was visiting her and her husband some years ago. I brought my artwork over to show them because they were interested, and there was a fellow there who I had not met before, but he was a friend of theirs. He told them when he left that house that his hands had been healed. He had some kind of deformation in his hands. I didn't see it because I didn't even know him. I knew he was handling my artwork, but I didn't know that he had had that experience until after the fact. So once again,
True.
Go ahead, please.
Sorry. It reminds me of, I brought him up to you before. I know you're familiar with, and I'm probably butchering his name, but Egyptian scientist, architect, Ibrahim Karim.
Ibrahim Karim.
Yeah, Karim, and his work in biogeometry, and I've mentioned some of it to you, Daniel, but he's actually been known to like show these symbols. And he said, like, I'm not the creator of biogeometry. I'm just sharing the rediscovery of it. But basically with these symbols, not only, exactly that. Those are the symbols that you could actually wear and stuff. And they were finding in studies that people could actually heal while wearing these symbols, and they didn't really understand why. And not only that, they also prove that when you actually incorporate this biogeometry and symbolism in agriculture, that the fruits would actually grow and they would stay more nutrition than something you would buy at the market. You wouldn't need to use pesticides. You wouldn't need to. And the farmers at first argued because they're like, why the hell do you want us to do this? Like, this is weird. And then they did, though, and they discovered, like, holy crap, like for some reason, there's like some power there, or there's some energy there that this is like causing a shift. So it's like super interesting. I'm still in the middle of all the biogeometry work to try and understand it, because it also is not just in agriculture or wearing a necklace or anything. It's also
multiple
like
uses.
It's the incorporation, even in facilities or buildings or churches, and the energy can be inside of something built with biogeometry in mind, which is incredible. It's crazy.
This is the ancient wisdom that is begging to be brought forth so that we can actually raise the human heart intelligence quotient. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That is what we're doing here. This is the purpose for bringing all of this geometry, sacred geometry, to the forefront. In order for us to take the next leap forward as a species, we must raise the heart intelligence quotient. The geometries are a mechanism to help assist with that. Okay.
That's the
last one.
Yeah, that's the last one. But I wanted to say that gives the notion of, in magic and other forms of spiritual practice, using sigils, right? A lot of people talk about the importance of that. And, there's probably a lot of real science behind why they work together in cohesion when people do like certain practices and stuff. So it's fascinating, though.
Every pattern has a meaning and it has a function, right? So with Ibrahim Kareem, I misplaced. There's something called an L. There may be more to the name of it, but if you take an L and the height of it is let's just say 1.618, and the base is 1, and then you put this little curve in it in the corner of the L where the vertical axis meets the horizontal axis. They called it an L, I think, back in the day when I got it from Robert Gilbert, who was actually a student of Ibrahim Kareem. Yes, he passed recently. Yes, right.
He had a show on Gaia called Sacred Geometry.
Yes. Well, I met Robert long before he became known, long before he developed Vesica.org in Asheville. He was actually dating a neighbor of mine, someone who lived behind me when I was living in Greensboro. So that's how I met Robert, not long after he came out of the military. So didn't get a chance to know him until after, when he got involved with sacred geometry. And I would go up to his workshops in the late 90s to Asheville. And in fact, he used to take my artwork and put it in his program just to have some sacred geometry in his presentations. And so that was a lot of fun.
That's pretty awesome.
One of the great mysteries is I have no idea where the original work of art that I gifted him is, because I have no connection with Vesica.org or his ex-wife or anything. So that's another work of art in limbo. But Robert did have one of my originals in his collection, or in his possession, I should say. I won't call it. I don't know if he had a collection, but he was in possession of that one particular work of art. So that's what yeah. Oh gosh, I mentioned the dream world. I was just with Robert Gilbert a few mornings ago. I don't know if it was 5 mornings ago or 4 mornings ago. And I was actually assisting him with getting him from one place to another. So he was trying to, gain access to some transportation or whatever. And he had some baggage and what have you. So that was fascinating to wake up from that dream. But, my dream world is just as alive as this dimension is.
We often talk on the show about how we are becoming more aware of different forms of reality that we're in, not just the human waking side, but, often we are in other places when we dream, or in between the sleep and awake state of mind, and even through meditation. But yeah, I think we're all waking up to the greater reality that we are not just in our human form, in our day to day.
Daniel, thank you for saying that. There's something really wonderful that happened some years ago. I had a near-death experience. I'm going to call it a near-death experience. It wasn't quite that. I had a few experiences that could be called near-death experiences. But anyway, I was recovering from something that happened in 2018. And during my recovery, my wife and I would sit and listen to generally 1 or no more than 2 chapters from one of the audio books that was available. And I say audio books, it really isn't an audio book, but there's a fellow named Martin John who was reading The Education of Oversoul 7 and posting them on YouTube. They're still there. And so I learned that this relationship between souls, if I may, like Oversoul 7 had an oversoul who was working with him. And Oversoul 7 was the oversoul of several, I'll use the word subordinate subsouls, and that's not the way it's language, but just for convenience sake. His Cypress was his oversoul that was guiding him, and he was guiding other souls that were, if I may, below him in this, I don't know what you call it, this fractal phenomenon of consciousness. And so one of the things that has come to my awareness is that what I'm doing is working with a lot of souls in the other dimensions. And I'm actually processing for a lot of souls. I'm not just processing for myself in the physical and in the dream state, but I'm also processing for other souls, if that makes any sense. So there is this beautiful collage of consciousness that if one finds themselves waking up in it, in this beautiful dream, if I may, it really gets to be crazy fascinating, crazy beautiful, And yeah, I don't know what else to say.
Well, I often wonder how much more aware are we in our dream state or in those altered states versus when we wake up, right? We could very much well be more aware of our how much we've been fractaled down to our physical reality versus the other states. I often wonder that. I know that Chris and John and myself have had very strange experiences where we were not ourselves, but we were, like I personally have been. I remember one quote unquote dream was I was an orb outside a craft and floating in the swamp area, and I was aware of that I was doing this thing and with others there. But then when I came back in my body, I was like, what? Where have I been? I feel so tired. Like I've been running a marathon, but I was only aware of that sliver of that experience. And I think that was my human self. It was myself just giving a little wink to my human experience, being like, yeah, there's other stuff going on. Here you go. I think that really is what's going on with a lot of us. And we are becoming more aware as we dive into the sacred geometry, what these deeper experiences are, then we become more aware of our connection to everything throughout.
Yeah. And this actually what you both were describing too has come up commonly in some of the hypnotherapy books I've read, where they would hypnotize, an individual, put them in the deepest levels of trance and get them to talk about what's going on or speak to the individual's higher self. And what this particular hypnotherapist discovered was that when we sleep, we're often doing things and we're not always meant to remember them. Maybe that's an agreement we made. Maybe it's something else. But like one particular individual, when she's asleep, and, they say when you sleep, you're astral, that her job outside of physical was to help other people transition when they pass. And that was her specific job. And there were other people who had different things, or maybe they were with other beings doing stuff. And I feel like all of the stuff we're talking about sounds crazy, but it's starting to become more normalized because you're starting to hear this stuff in the spiritual communities. And I feel like more research is being done as well. Hypnotherapy and people being more open to psychedelics, and they're having psychedelic experiences. And then they find that in the psychedelic experience, it's what people are saying in the near-death experience, and what people are saying in the near-death experience, they're saying in the abduction experience. And there's just interconnected consciousness, role I play stuff that the universe is more vast and we ourselves are more vast than we fully understand right now.
I'm trying to remember his name. There's a video that was made back in the either late 80s or the late 70s or the early 90s, and it was called The Global Brain. Peter Russell is his name. Peter Russell created this beautiful video, VHS video called The Global Brain, and it's still, I think it's still available. I think you can still find it. But the thesis was that what is happening is that with our advancement of technology, it makes it possible for more human beings to be connected, right? So here we are talking about this subject. This subject has always been happening with humans forever. And so now 3 of us are talking about this, and more people are going to see this production and say, okay, yeah, I have experiences related to that. So what I'm getting at is that because of technology, more people are saying, yes, I have an experience that's very much related to the experience that they're talking about. So it's a way of confirming for others their experience, hearing other people talk about it. But it's been happening forever. There's nothing new. We're not talking about anything new. There is nothing new to talk about. There is no experience new to talk about. People have been experiencing angelic beings, higher dimensional beings, travelers from other dimensions forever. And because we have technology that makes it possible to share the story across the globe, that's how we have this, oh yeah, well, that's real. But it's always been real. It's always been the human experience. I'm really happy to see us being able to connect in cyberspace and confirm for others things that they know to be true in their hearts. So wonderful tool. If we use it properly, it can actually serve in ways that helps to lift people up and take us closer to, I'm not going to say any words that have different meanings to other people, but I'll say the reawakening. I call it the reawakening, okay? Or the great return. So imagine a time in a so-called future where anybody that you see on the street, you recognize yourself in them, and you recognize that you see yourself in them and they see themselves in you. And so the namaste, or the I recognize the divine one in you, is a very natural, sincere gesture and true. And so I think we're coming to that, right? We have to divorce ourselves from fear and all of the entities that feed on fear. We have to send them packing, right?
We've had this conversation between ourselves, but I think it's true. I believe it to be true, is a lot of the turmoil we're seeing in the open world and all the system being shook and the system shaking as we know it. I think that inversely is part of this, you said, reawakening. It's tied to that, and we can sense it, but it also is scary at the same time of change, because us as humans don't like it.
Oh, I mean, really, what's happening to so many people on the planet is terrifying, right? Heartbreaking and terrifying. And yet, each one of us are having the experience that we agreed to have. That's my contention. So I call it soul contract. I really believe that all of us are living our soul contracts, even if we don't know it. I know a lot of people would take issue with me on the notion of each one of us living our soul contract, because a lot of people say, well, how can you say that's true when such and such is happening to so-and-so over here? Well, it's my truth. It doesn't have to be the person who I'm speaking to. It doesn't have to be their truth.
Yeah. Well, I think with people that have experiences, that comes down to them having to understand that for themselves in their own, as they work through whatever, if it's positive or it's a negative experience, or in life, we are given a lot of, pluses and minuses. And so I think that's an internal work that we have to do. And then that kind of, because I know for myself, I've come to that conclusion through certain experiences I've had with other beings and other things, where it was like in the moment, I was very aware that, I agreed to this. Oh yeah, sorry, completely forgot about this, guys. And then there's other times where I've gone through a lot of struggle and interpreted it as, what did I do wrong to deserve this or whatever? But that's a process we have to go through. But it can be sometimes hard to understand the vastness of reality's experience as humans. And what is this experience that we're having, positive or negative? Is this negative right now? Then it'll turn into wisdom later. We don't know, but that's that process we have to go through ourselves.
Yeah. And I agree. And it's one of those things. And it's like you hear about this stuff in near-death experiences, and then some people, maybe even atheists, and not believe in any of this stuff. And then they have an NDE, and they're like, yeah, like I chose to come here. I was shown, like I chose my parents. I did all this stuff. That free will still exists. You can still have free will and make your own choices. And that's the part that gets a little complicated for people to understand. You still have free will. It's not like this is going to happen because of this, but there are certain like markers in a particular life that may have to come to pass for one reason or another, or agreement. And I think that one of the reasons people don't like it is that it forces you to be accountable. And some people aren't at the stage in their life to be accountable for certain things for one reason or another. And I'm told, or I understand, that even though we may not understand why someone would make that choice, even if they don't remember it, I'm talking spiritual, like before incarnating, right? Even if we can't understand that choice, that it did happen, that we did do it for one reason or another, and that there are many reasons as to why an individual may make that choice, as there are people. Like I don't understand why some people don't like macaroni and cheese. Like I have no idea. How do you not like macaroni and cheese, right? But it's through source or creation that wishes to express itself in many infinite ways, which makes sense to me, that it wants to experience the infinite. I think we should also like respect people's freedom to allow them to believe whatever they want until they experience it to such a time where they understand it. Because that often happens. There's so many times I hear people like against NDEs, then they have an NDE and they're like, oh my God, it's true. And I have a friend who had a near-death experience, and she told me, she's like, everything, all that stuff you talk about, it's real. Like me and Vandorn have had a conversation off camera, but experience is like the best teacher. And that's when you finally experience it for yourself, you're like, I understand now, I get it. It makes more sense. But from a certain level of awareness, certain level of understanding, it doesn't make sense. And you may even combat it. And that may not be where you're at right now. But Vandorn, I just wanted to ask, is there anything you wish to share with our audience, or a quote of wisdom, or anything you'd like to share before
Thank you. Well, I want to piggyback on what you just said, Christian. You remind me of many years ago, a group of spiritual teachers, I'll say that because they do exist as a lineage. Their advice is, don't believe a word that I say, prove it to yourself. And there's a book that was written by a man named Paul Twitchell titled The Tiger's Fang. And he titled that book that because I'm not going to spoil the story. Some of you go find a book titled The Tiger's Fang. It's a beautiful spiritual adventure story that I read back in the mid 70s, I'm guessing. And the idea is that if you say that you pulled a tiger's fang, you better have proof. But we can't prove the stories that we tell people. We can't provide them with proof. We can prove it to ourselves because we believe in our experiences. So one of the things that I say to people is that don't believe anything that anybody tells you unless you can prove it to yourself. And I consider to be a good marker for sanity is believing in one's experience. Okay. So, it's a real healthy marker, a real marker for, as far as I'm concerned, for sanity is believe in your experience. Don't believe in what somebody tells you. So before we had this conversation today, I was talking to someone who I thought that I was actually going to be on a Zoom call tonight, but it's not until next week. The subject is, where is God? And the answer is, anywhere that you believe God is. And I love it. And that's the answer that I came up with as I was thinking about the subject. Where is God? God is anywhere that you believe God is, which means that it's a personal experience. It's not something that you have to be in agreement with somebody else about. You have to be in agreement with yourself about the question. And that's where it begins and that's where it ends. So truth is relative and nobody has to be wrong. That's what I would like to leave us with today.
I hope you all enjoyed this. And for anyone watching, if you'd like to see more conversations like this, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell notification icon so you can be notified when we drop more episodes like this. And thank you, Vandorn, for taking the time to speak with us today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.